Hello, 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 everybody. All, however many there are of you in there.
Oh, both of
Um,
you?
yeah, all both of you. We have a very special stream for you guys today. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation and everything. It's the secret origins of comics, kind of a little overview of early comics history, or at least from the Victorian and Platinum ages, which, as you can see from the title of the PowerPoint, is roughly going from late 18th century to the 1930s and the birth of the comic book format as we know it. And yeah, so I'm excited because this is an often overlooked part of comic book history. And as a very obsessive comic book nerd, I want to know every nook and cranny of the medium's history. And I want to share that with everyone. So without further ado, I think we'll just jump in. We got Dan here as well, but you
You.
cannot see his beautiful mug, unfortunately.
That's why no one's here.
Yeah, if your face was here, we'd be making the real big bucks. But and also this idea was kind of inspired. I recently went to Columbus and I visited the Billy Ireland Museum, which is one of the most like extensive museums of comic book history. It's got original artwork from everybody from like E.C. Segar to Frank Miller, and it was a really cool experience. I took a bunch of pictures, which a lot of them are included in here. Um, but if you ever get the chance, if you're ever in Ohio for any reason and you like comics, I definitely recommend checking it out. But
The Billie Eilish Museum of
yeah,
Comics.
yeah, who knew she had such a big impact in the field? But first, here we got some. These are some etchings that are kind of predecessors to comics, and there are a few. Before I go in depth in these, I got understanding comics as kind of a guide for some of the conversation here today. Set my mic down. Can you still hear me good?
Yep.
So prior to what we're seeing here with these etchings, which are dated, the one on the left is 1795, I believe, and the one on the right is 1798. But there are previous examples of things that could be considered comics prior to this. One of them being the Bio Tapestry, which is, I don't know how well everyone will be able to see it, but is pictured here in Understanding Comics, as well as some of the other examples he gives are. Oh, did I lose you, Dan?
No, I just
Oh, you're
maximized your
showing me.
screen.
Yeah. As well as here's the Tortures of Saint Erasmus from 1460. So the history of comics is kind of murky prior to like the printing press, but once we get to the printing press and we start getting newspapers in full, we start getting things like political cartoons. So if you'll pull that back up, yep, we see things like this. The one on the left is the lawyers something circuit, the lawyer's last circuit, which pictures them with a bunch of skeletons, and I'm sure that was very relevant at the time, but I'm not entirely sure what it means now. But
Does it say
and
to hell? What
yeah, I
does it
think they're
say?
going to hell. I guess people have just always hated lawyers, which is good to know.
Imagine that.
Yeah, but one thing in terms of technique and craft that I think is really interesting in the history of comics is a lot of it went hand in hand with the reproduction technology that they had available to them. So, as you can imagine, in the 1700s, it was pretty primitive as compared to what we have now. So the way that these things were drawn were with that in mind. So it's a lot of hatching and cross hatching. But even then, if you can get a good look, a lot of this is a very simplified form of drawing. It's very rudimentary, and it has a lot of simple hatching detail, so that it could be easily transferred and printed in mass quantities. And this is something you see even up into like the later comic books, because I remember growing up when I'd see golden age comic books, I'd be like, why do they look so goofy? And it's literally just the technology had to be taken into account when producing a lot of this artwork, because if you were to go too in detail with your line work when it was reproduced onto very poor quality newsprint, it would just bleed everywhere, it would lose all that detail. So a lot of that was kept in mind by these artists during this time period. And I just think that's very interesting to the history, how much the technology, because you don't really think of comic books as a very technologically advanced art form. But
Yeah, it's also
going,
crazy, like the way the amount of time they would have spent on it. I mean, it
uh
probably was like produced in newspapers or anything, but the whole point was they would make it, it'd make the rounds, and then it would be thrown away the next day.
Like it's a miracle that even these things survive. Because with like regular art museums, that art is supposed to be preserved. That's a big part of it. But with this, it was it was trash. I mean, it's a miracle if anybody kept a newspaper around. And like you were saying, these things were produced quickly because they didn't have photographs, obviously. So political cartoons, both in their satirical elements, but both in their depiction of events, were very important because that's how people got this information. So it was a very valuable skill to have if you could draw something quickly, especially as it pertains to historical events. But
Yeah,
move.
I mean,
Mhm.
instead of that's what's wild. I mean, and this gets into a debate in indie comics of time versus perfection, quality versus quantity, and all that.
Mhm.
But I mean, Jack Kirby was able to put out what 2 or 3 books a month of
Oh
the
yeah, he's a
highest.
workaholic.
Yeah, these guys probably had to draw, you think, like what, like every day, maybe have it done
Hmm.
a day, or at least like a day in advance, maybe.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. And this is something I wanted to bring into the conversation. I guess we can bring it in now. With modern comics, obviously a lot of art is done digitally now, and I have no major qualms with digital art. But myself, I prefer to do ink on paper. I just prefer the tactility of it. But that being said, I do think that in the shift to digital, you do lose a lot of that essential kind of craft to it. Because even though these things are produced quickly, I mean, the amount of line work that goes into the shading and the detail with that hatching and cross hatching, especially later when we get into like Thomas Nast, the amount of like hard labor that went into these things is incredible, and you just don't really see that a lot in comics anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, you don't. It seems like it still is the assembly line kind of idea of like you draw it and then like you kind of like do the outline. Someone else does the coloring, someone else does the inking, and that can be good if like you get a good team. It can also be terrible.
Yeah, it just all depends. But moving forward into the 1800s, the example on the right, I believe it's from the 1840s, and it is the first use of the term cartoon to describe this drawing style. Um, and again, that goes for as this style emerged as compared to traditional high art, it was, representational drawings that were mostly drawings, it was line work. So you compare that to a traditional painting, there's no holding lines on the outline of a body the way there are in comic book drawings, and then they're colored in later. So it really became a language unto itself as it developed, apart from kind of what we think of as high art, your Renaissance paintings and such, which I think is a really interesting distinction, especially by the time you get to like the 80s and 90s when comic book styles are really opening up and you get people like Alex Ross who are essentially doing Renaissance paintings. I just think it's interesting that juxtaposition when this was really its own language, both for practical purposes and printing, but also for what it was trying to do with caricature and exaggeration, and not trying to be 100% lifelike.
What's up, Bats? Glad you can make it, man.
Yeah, you're gonna learn a lot. This is a learning episode.
Bats is a good guy. He does comic reviews and he writes his own stuff on Substack that's pretty cool. Some of it's parody. This is like Warhammer parody that's funny.
Oh, nice.
He's got a book or two out. I know he did at least one novel that's like something of a satire, and
Hmm.
I'm trying to get him on. I think he's gonna start doing like audio drama stuff as well.
Oh,
So
nice.
everybody
Shout
go
out
follow
Bats.
yeah, let me get I'll put his Twitter in the chat. Go ahead, man.
Yeah. And then on the right, we have Puck, which was an early humor magazine. I believe that's from the 1880s. And I think that one is a very clear example of the exaggeration and caricature elements of early
Hmm.
comic books, early cartoonings. Because, again, as opposed to traditional representational art, there was the taking liberties of how you draw these things and what elements to make important. And one thing I found in my own journey of comic book art and cartooning is the fact that it's kind of a less is more thing. It's like, what are the elements that are essential to create a human face, as opposed to if you're doing a hyper realistic painting, you're trying to capture it perfectly. With this, it's kind of reduction and reduction into what's the most important, what are the most essential elements to communicate this thing to the reader. And then once you get to those essential elements, it's about what can I do? Can I make that nose longer to make it funnier, or communicate something about the character? Do I give him a snub nose to make him look more intimidating? Um, and again, that's all in the language of this stuff as it developed, especially as it pertains to like political cartoons. That was a big part of it, was the exaggeration, the caricature of what they were drawing.
Hmm. You have to know what you're doing. You have to know anatomy enough to distort it.
Mm-hmm. But moving forward onto the next slide, um, the one on the left, I think, is a great example of that exaggeration. Where I mean, it's hyper detailed, especially when it comes to shading and lighting. But those don't look like normal human faces. It's elongated. The perspective is wonky on the faces, but that's the elements of artistic liberty taken in these things to get that exaggerated feel to portray, especially when you're satirizing something, to portray these elements. Specifically, the one on the left is the anti-cartoon bill, and if you know anything about comics history, they've always been contentious when it came to censorship, especially by the time you get to like the 50s, with the Comics Code of Authority and such. But when you're trying to portray those things, there's certain liberties that are taken to do that. And then the example on the right is a Thomas Nast, and you may recall learning about him in your history class. But I mean, if you want to talk technique, craft, I mean, he is the man to look to. Again, I wish that you could see these pictures in full, or again, take a trip to the Billy Ireland if you want to. But like getting to see his hatching work in detail is immaculate, especially up on those curtains, the way he's using the density of the lines to portray certain values and distance. It's uh it's truly like a master. And again, like not to harp on like, because I don't like just shitting on things, and I don't think modern comics are just bad, but I do think that is an element that's lost, is that like very technical, craft heavy element of making these drawings.
Well, that's why I think in the '90s, like because we praised them, the main artists from Marvel and DC, and they deserve that title. Like I know, especially when McFarlane started, he just started inking his own stuff because he got
Oh yeah.
tired of, the process. Like, don't even like crosshatch really. Like, don't even do that. Just leave it up to the inks. And
Hmm.
it was an inker that ruined Kirby's art.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of that I think is like because cross hatching is to show where inking should go and how it should go. Um, so yeah, I agree with you. And you can tell this was done quickly. It's just that this
Hmm.
guy had massive skill. Like, these guys can do that. If you see like a really good artist sit at a table and in like 30 seconds draw something really crazy cool, like you realize that, oh my god, these people are like printers almost.
Oh yeah. Well, and again, like it's interesting to think that like this was partially to keep in mind the printing technology at the time. So when you get to see these originals and seeing like the amount of care that went into every line when considering all parts of the process. And another fun detail, and we'll see these in some more of the pictures, but you can see where like things are pasted up, like where it says Citizens Union, and then the thing
Hmm.
at the bottom. Um, that's one thing too. Is like these are all parts of a process. Obviously, this one wouldn't be colored, but like um, a lot of people, you can't, especially back in the day when these things were actually done on boards, you can't be too precious with it. You really gotta finish the page and move forward, send it along to the next person. So there was a lot of paste ups, a lot of whiteout that you could see on the board. And it really humanizes the art form, because sometimes when you see the final printed page, it's like some of these lines look so perfect. And some of that just comes down to the page reduction. You're doing it twice up or something, and then when it's printed and it's half the size, that line's going to look better. But getting to see the humanity in each line is really important to me, both as a fan of this stuff, but as an artist myself. I really like being able to see like the slight wobble in a line that makes me know it was done by a human.
It's also crazy how great the perspective is on that one on the right. Like you can see even through a screen of a picture of it, you can see the depth of it,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not
And
even at
it,
a good angle.
yeah, yeah, no, the pictures are not the best. I never claimed to be a photographer. Um, and what's funny is in that right picture, you can also see in the background the dude is a Freemason. He's got his hand in the pocket or in like the
Mm,
in the buttons. They were everywhere.
were.
All right, and then, well, so now we're getting to like the actual comic book, panels in sequence to tell a story. And
Hmm.
the first example was the Yellow Kid, which I think was 1893 or 95, somewhere around there. And what's interesting about this period is newspapers would market heavily on their comics and their comic strips because, I mean, every newspaper is going to be printing the same news. You can't really like up your game by being like, we have more news. So it would be the selling point. A lot of times would be like what comics you were able to get syndicated in your paper. Um, and like I said, the Yellow Kid being the first one. And what's interesting too is because the other ones were kind of the previous examples were kind of laying out the language of the actual drawings. But once you get into this period, you see the foundational storytelling mechanics of comics
Hmm.
starting to take shape. You see the first speech bubbles. And to that point, the Yellow Kid, all his text would be on his clothes instead of being done as a speech bubble. Um, but I find it very interesting that like now these things are set in stone. When you make a comic book, you have one panel after another. You have the characters speak in speech bubbles, their thoughts with thought bubbles, motion lines. But this was all brand new at this time. This had never really been done before. And it's so interesting to me to see the idiosyncrasies of each artist trying to figure out these things as they went along.
Yeah, and the way like changing layout for the way that the newspaper were gonna do it,
Mm-hmm.
and growing, getting more freedom, going changing like the thing that you see the top right there. It's a comic strip, but it doesn't have different panels.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time you get to the bottom, you've got it figured out kind of, and you can actually see a changing environment. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
floating in air anymore.
Yeah. Well, and what you were saying about like the formatting of it, since you'd be selling these for syndication, they'd be going to a bunch of different papers. A lot of times you would have them be in the panel formats they were in, so they could be formatted differently for the comics page. So
Hmm.
you would have them basically just be the individual panels, and then it was up to the individual paper to decide how it would format each one to fit that page. Um, which I think is interesting because by the time we get like even a few decades after this, once we start getting to people like Winsor McKay and George Harriman with the stuff they were doing, where they really took advantage of panel layouts and page composition, stuff that you wouldn't be afforded unless you knew what your page was going to be. I think it's so interesting that the things we think of as foundational to comics were really like they evolved as the technology evolved, as the parameters evolved to allow the artist more creativity and more room to grow along with it. But moving forward, let's see where we're at now. It'll load. All right, now we're at Winsor McKay. So the one on the left is from Little Nemo in Slumberland.
Oh yeah, and if anyone knows anything about Little Nemo, they know the art is fantastic.
Oh yeah, that
Like,
was literally
dude,
the
that dude
first
is
thing I was gonna
great.
bring
Yeah.
up. Yeah, like I wish you could see it as close as I saw it. Like the line work is just so precise. Like these are drawings that could be done today, like in that style, and I don't think anyone would bat an eye because it's
Mm-mm.
just so perfect.
It's
And
what like stuff like that Mobius reached for. Like,
mm-hmm,
there's no way that those guys, like those French guys that mastered layout, didn't know about Little Nemo. Like, they
oh yeah,
obviously had to have, because like look at the perspective and like that top panel. That's almost like a Da Vinci perspective, like the way that it's perfectly laid out and the way that it's, like if you could, you could study like the dimensions of like the Last
mm-hmm.
Supper like your whole life. Like, look at
Well, and
that. Like,
like
that's
the
fantastic.
perspective, the perspective of that alone is difficult, but adding in a checkerboard floor Like,
Well, the Freemasons.
yeah, exactly. Well, and like the only person I can think of that has done a checkerboard floor in perspective that well is like Katsuhiro Otomo and Akira.
Hmm.
Like, and that's another master. But then even going into those lower panels, again, it's kind of hard to see, but like it has him walking on stilts, and he's with a bunch of these storks with really long legs. So each one of those lines, he's having to draw with different line weights to show where they are in
Hmm.
perspective without it getting confusing to the reader and looking like just a bunch of random lines. And actually, if you want to put me on the main screen, I have a collection of some of
Me.
Windsor McKay stuff, if you'd be so kind.
Let me see
Um,
if I can. Let me see if I can do it real quick.
there we go. So this is Windsor McKay Early Works Volume 6. And you can find these. They have them. I found them at a couple places around the Charlotte area. Heroes, which is a pretty big comic shop here, put on Heroes Con. They have some, but let me find. So, trying to find a good example of what he was doing before Little Nemo. Um, because Little Nemo was essentially a spin-off of these really kind of surreal strips he would do called Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, where it would be just
Mm.
a weird dream scenario, and it would always end with the person waking up and being like, "I must have eaten a rare bit of meat," and that was always the punchline. But you can really see him starting to experiment with the stuff he would go for later. Like, and some of them are just so weird. Like this one, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's just a kid with a really long neck.
Yeah.
And what's funny too is like again, as these rules are being made, like you can see the speech bubbles, although they're pretty close to what we think of. Some of them, the tails are just a line. And Winsor McKay, as good as his art was, he was notorious for being a terrible letterer. Like some of his stuff is just illegible. Let me find. I also got, and this I'll go a little more depth in later in terms of the influence of this stuff. But Raw Magazine printed some of the Dream of the Rarebit Fiend strips. I'm trying to find it. And what's nice about it being printed in this large format is you can see all that detail. Here it is. And again, like the line work is just immaculate. And like the hatching on that bridge, like it's just the line work is so exact. Like and I couldn't imagine having to rule out each of those lines. I assume he would have done all that by hand because it would have been a pain in the ass to have to rule out every single one of those lines to get them so precise. But like, there's a lot of stories, especially from like Will Eisner, where he would talk about in his shop. He would have competitions with his the other cartoonists trying to see who could draw the straightest line freehand. So a lot of these guys, they took the craft super seriously, like down to how well can I draw a line without a ruler. If you want to throw back up the PowerPoint,
Now I'm just gonna leave you up there.
yeah, I'll just entertain everybody. I'll do a little song and dance.
Gonna start juggling.
Yeah, juggling all my comic books over here. And then the picture on the right is interesting because Winsor McKay, not only was he a pioneer of comics, he was also a pioneer of animation. So that's a cell from one of the earliest animations. I believe it was like 1914 or so. It was about a brontosaurus. But that just goes to show like animation and comics have always been cousins. I mean, you see it with like
Hmm.
manga and anime, but in the West, that kind of relationship has been devalued a lot. But I mean, it makes sense. They're both drawings. One of them is just moving. But Winsor McKay definitely had his hands in a lot of stuff at the time. And then moving forward, let's see what we got next. So these are some examples of the other comic strips that would have been big at the time. Mutt and Jeff, I'm not super familiar, but I did want to include this one because it was popular in like 1900s to 1920s in these syndicated strips. But the other one on the right is Crazy Cat. This is a later one where he
Hmm.
was allowed to have that full page layout and have all that creativity. But I also have this, and you can get this book on Amazon for like a couple bucks, but it's a collection of his earlier ones, and a lot of them would just be 4 panel strips and very bare, very minimal. But then you compare that to the stuff he's doing later, and he has the freedom. But George Herman not only was what he was doing with page layout and composition really interesting. But as a writer, and some of it kind of can go over your head because it is from the 1900s, like the early 1900s, but a very clever writer who was able to work in a lot of puns and plays on words. And like this is going kind of in depth into George Herman, but like I believe he was like mixed race. Like I think he was biracial. Like one parent was black, one was white, and at the time he had to hide that, especially because I think he was white passing. But he would have little nods to it in his comics. And there's one strip where Ignatz, so the Ignatz and Crazy Cat are like the main characters of the strip, but Crazy Cat
Wait,
is crying to the cop, and he's like, "Man, Ignatz called me a really mean word," and the cop is like, "Oh no, what did he call you?" And then he said, "He called me an enigma," and being a play on a word that I'm not gonna say. But yeah, George Herman, his influence on a lot of comics later is profound for like the next 100 years. I believe the Comics Journal at the around the turn of the century into the 2000s, they did a list of like their top 100 comics. Crazy Cat was number one. It's held in very high regard. I think it was what is it E. Cummings, the poet. He praised the comic strip, and if you know anything about comics history, I mean, comics were not taken seriously by the fine arts world or anyone outside of comics. So to have a poet, you know, singing the praises of a comic strip back in the 1920s really goes to show just how like amazing this work was. I have another collection of Crazy Cat stuff where I can find some more examples of just how, if you want to throw my screen back up there, but like his panel layouts were just wildly inventive, especially for the time where the language of comics was still being figured out. Like he would just be having panels wherever he wanted them, like just going wild on the page with his storytelling. Not to mention his use of color is just so bold and like inventive. Um,
and you can see where early Disney got its influence.
oh yeah, especially because again, animation and cartoons, they're very much cousins. And like also one thing that was specific to the medium as it pertains to Crazy Cat was because there had been animated adaptations of Crazy Cat since like the late 20s, I believe, into like the 50s. They were still doing them, but George Herman always imagined Crazy Cat as kind of this genderless sprite, neither male nor female. And on the page, you can portray that because you give the character whatever voice you want to. But in the animated adaptations, you know, you'd have to have a male or a female voice actor, so they could never quite capture that androgynous quality of Crazy Cat. And on to the next slide.
So he's kind
Um,
of like James. So it's kind of like James Corden.
I guess you could say that. um, on the left we have on the left we have that's a sketch George Herman, creator of Crazy Cat, did, and then on the right that is a full page of original artwork done by Billy Ireland. He was I think it was the Columbus Dispatch. He was like the cartoonist there from like
Hmm.
1900s, 1920s. But that one's cool because it seems to be all done on the board and it's inked and watercolored. Because I'm assuming he would have just done the watercoloring on top of the inking, but I have an example of how coloring used to be done. This is one of kind of my prized possessions, but this is a proof page for Heavy Metal magazine that I got from John Workman, who was the art director there for a good number of years. But you can
Hmm.
see how the coloring was done in separated layers underneath the inks on like these acetate pages to build out the coloring of the drawing. And then here you can see it too. That's just the ink layer. If I can, yeah. So that's just the ink, and then below that you have the colors, and that's how it would be done. Whether they were doing it with, they were, and I'm not 100% sure on technical terms, but sometimes they do it with color acetate pieces that they cut out to the shape they needed. Other times you can find like Lynn Varley, her color pages for Dark Knight Returns. You can find online how she would do it with the black line, flipping it up and then doing like
Hmm.
gouache. I think it was either gouache or watercolor, and doing the colors underneath and having to flip back and forth. And she probably had blue line there, but that one, as opposed to those methods, looks like it was all done just right on the board. And one more fun fact about Mr. Billy Ireland, his middle name is Addison, and as a man named Addison, it gave me some confidence in having a woman's name.
Well, a lot of those names kind of like were like back in the day, like Ashley, I think was a boy's name for a long time, and
Yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah. See, gender is a fluid concept, so I can be named Addison. And then here we have a strip by a name you might recognize, Rube Goldberg, as in Rube Goldberg machines, but he was actually a cartoonist, and he would do a lot of his Rube Goldberg machines as cartoons, as you can see here. An overly complicated way to accomplish a very
This is
simple
before or
task.
after he won the WWE Championship.
I did not know about that part of his history.
That's really cool. I wonder if like this is where Dr. Seuss got a lot of his inspiration from in some of these early comics.
Oh yeah, Dr. Seuss was heavily involved in like kind of early comics, especially because
He was a
when he
war
was in
cartoonist,
the
wasn't he? Yeah.
military. Yeah, exactly. In World War II, along with like Stan Lee and some of the other, like I think Will Eisner did some war cartoons as well, but they were all kind of in a group together. So he like with a lot of the creators that we kind of know a lot more from fairly recent history. Your Jack Kirby's, your Steve Ditko's, your Will Eisner's, all those guys. They were all influenced by this stuff because before they came along and started doing the more like superhero books and things of that like, this is what comics were. So they were very much looking at all this stuff as influence, as inspiration. And next, let's see. So we have on the left is a original
Oh,
Dick
Dick Tracy was
Tracy.
great.
Um, oh yeah, and I have some Dick Tracy comics as well that I'll pull out for our viewing pleasure. But I think what's interesting with Dick Tracy is we start to get to the point of starting to recognize comics as we kind of
Yeah.
know them today. It's a little less abstract in the line work, a little less cartoony. It's more focused on action storytelling. Let me find a good example in here. Um, but just in the way the figures are drawn, there's still a good amount of exaggeration, but it's much more resembling what we see in like Golden Age comics and comic books. And again, with it being kind of more crime, suspense,
Pulp.
action
Yeah.
stories. Yeah, exactly. Um, it's much more similar. So we see not only the art form and the techniques evolving, but the types of stories they're telling with these things
And
evolving
Dick
as
Tracy had a
well.
lot of like
And
sci-fi
then,
elements in it too.
oh yeah, well, and like that's the thing too is a lot of these strips, and I mean you see it into like early Silver Age kind of Batman stories would have
Hmm.
sci-fi elements. The genres were very fluid. It was never just you're doing one thing. It was always a blend of things. Especially you got to think at the time you're cranking one of these out a week. You got to keep the readers interested. So might have to throw an
Well, the guy on
alien
the,
in
like in
there.
that strip on the left is like being shot. He's like dead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. Well, one thing I think is interesting is like we have this perception of comics, or I guess just in general media for kids being very safe and very tame. But I mean, this stuff was supposed to be, for families, for kids, and they would get extremely violent. Same with like Golden Age comics. You'd have Batman killing
Hmm.
people,
The
and
Shadow.
there's like yeah, and like Batman had a gun in some of the early ones, so like they didn't shy away from that. And I wonder if that's probably just because violence was more prevalent to the readers, So like a kid seeing a guy die in a comic is like, well, I saw a guy die last week, so it's no
And I wonder
biggie.
if they also like just had a great separation of things where it's like, no, like that's a cartoon. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah,
I mean, like when I play video games with like my kids, like you kill like a goblin in Zelda, they're like, "Oh, he's dead," but they don't think about it too much. It's just like, "Oh, the bad guy died."
They're
Yeah,
not
and
grieving.
it's not like, "Oh my god, he
Yeah,
died." It's like, okay, the bad guy died. Who cares? Like,
yeah. And then on the right is an EC Seagar. What is it like? Thimble
hmm
Feeder or something was where Popeye
and see that
originated,
that almost
and
looks
this
like
is
early
Eugene.
manga, like in like
Yeah, I can see that.
in like an almost kawaii way. I mean, he's an ugly little cat or something, but you know what I mean, like the way it's designed.
Oh yeah, well, like the exaggerated features, it looks like Osamu
hmm
Tezuka, Astro Boy, and like 50s, 60s manga, very much kind of carried on that very cartoony style. But what's interesting too is like that strip in particular, the Eugene the Jeep, I think is what it's called, or that's the character. It's like a weird meta thing where Popeye is asking his, I think it's his father, maybe it's some character that looks just like Popeye, is asking him what is Eugene the Jeep, and the whole time it's a very like self-referential thing. And like I'm like they're basically doing postmodernism in like the 30s when this came out. And there's examples of that too in like early Plastic Man by Jack Cole. They're like they were doing very weird self-referential meta fourth wall breaking stuff in some of these strips, stuff that like you don't see in mainstream art and literature until years later, where it's like taken
Well, I think that's the thing
seriously.
is that it's not taken seriously, and you know, it's kind of like that. I'm not going to philosophize too much because I'll ruin it. But that's the idea of like the child in art and in the divine
Mm-hmm.
space is that it can do things, it has potential, and it's just accepted. And then the more older you get, the more rigid. Then you have to explain things, you have to think about things instead of it just being an intuition, and that's the thing, like, no one was when no
Mm-hmm.
one took these seriously, you could do things like that, and, like, no one cared. They didn't think about it too
Yeah, it
much.
was just done
Yeah,
for
and,
fun.
like, it could even be serious, like, Dick Tracy was serious, but it was still I think this goes to the mystification idea of the longer podcast we're gonna have to talk through, of mystification and
Mm-hmm.
demystification. You know what I mean?
Well, and I think that like, oh yeah, and I think as it pertains to comic books, I think there's a lot there in kind of like the childlike innocence of comics being gone, and I think that can be seen in the art as the art veered from these cartoonish representations, these exaggerated representations, to more realism. And there is something to be said about like someone who can draw very technically detailed stuff that looks and emulates real life. But I think the point of having something that can mirror real life, but in a fantastical way, as these early cartoon strips did, I think there's something too that's lost when you just go for straight realism. You lose that fun element, that childlike element that makes a lot of these things so fun to
Mhm.
read.
Well, the thing is, and I don't know if we've ever had this conversation on air, and I think we should because like Josh and I used to have it a lot, or at least I would do it, which is when you're writing for kids, it used to be understood that kids could understand things, they weren't stupid. And now it's like
Mm-hmm.
everything for kids is like SpongeBob levels dumb. And
Hey, don't say that about those
well, it's like
SpongeBob
it's not
movies.
even
The early seasons are
well, it's like
great.
like nowadays it's like it's not written for kids, it's written for adults who want to like laugh at kid stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When you write something for kids, like they can understand everything from like a narrative perspective for the most part. Like when you read books at that time, like it didn't treat them like they were stupid. And I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
thing is like
Oh yeah.
these were made so that they knew kids would read them in the newspaper, but they were also so that like your dad could laugh at them too, you know.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is like there's a difference between like kid media and like
Mhm.
family friendly, where like family, I think, or like all ages, should strive to be something that anyone from ages whenever you can read to when you're dying can
Yeah,
enjoy.
and like with
And
that, like
again,
I
like
don't think that means because so much stuff people like something writing for kids are like it's like easy or that it's simple or that it's shallow. And it's like no, if you're writing for kids, like you're trying to articulate really deep concepts in a way that anyone can understand them. And what that means is that you have to understand them.
oh yeah, I mean like going back to Dr. Seuss, all of his greatest works were distilling these very complex ideas into ways that kids could understand, like racism, classism, environmentalism. And I mean, you can enjoy those works at just face value as fun little stories, but they're also teaching, some moral element. But even though it's done through allegory, it's still a strong way to present those things to
What's what
young
you just
people.
said. You can't have an allegory if you're not allegorizing something, and if you don't have a
Mm-hmm.
moral standard, and we can talk about what morals are, which morals more importantly are, or what you should or shouldn't do. But when you don't have any at all, that's when you just fall into ad absurdum, which is what I think the like Tumblr idea is. And we all kind of know what that is when you say it and you think about it. It's like that's why it doesn't have any backbone or anything to say, and that's why it's just absurd.
Yeah, it doesn't have the
Yeah,
substance
and well, like you
behind
said,
it.
like something like Dr. Seuss and like every single person on every side of the political spectrum can find something in Seuss to love and to hate if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the point. At least the man is saying something.
Yeah. Well, on to the next slide.
Nice.
And then, so that's
Oh
Nancy
yeah,
Strip on the left,
Nancy's still running, I think.
and some Alex. Oh yeah, they've had it because this was the Ernie Bushmeyer, I think was his name, years who basically created the Nancy Strip. And then on the right you have Alex Raymond, and I kind of wanted to pair these up because they're coming out at pretty much the same time, but on completely different ends
Hmm.
of the spectrum, as to what comics could do. Alex Raymond, very technical artist, like very good at capturing lifelike figures, its detail, its hatching, all there. And then on the other side, you have that reduction down to the bare essentials, where Nancy's face is like a few lines away from being just a little smiley face
Yeah, it
circle, you
somehow
know?
works really well, and more importantly, it's ridiculously consistent.
Mm-hmm. Well, because that's the thing too. You like is it's when you're stripping things down to their bare minimum, you're finding what's most important. You're able to get the things out in that concise way. And like I didn't include any examples because he's outside of the time frame, but like that's what makes
Hmm.
Peanuts, Charles Schulz, work so well. Is I mean, like some of those strips in like 4 panels are like basically discussing themes of like existentialism and nihilism and depression with these little cartoon figures, and like they're ridiculously simple drawings as compared to someone like Alex Raymond, but they still are able to convey so much emotion and so much pathos, to them, that like if you drew them hyper realistically, it wouldn't carry the same weight, I
Well,
don't
it's like
think.
that chart of like the uncanny valley, like where it falls. I
Mm-hmm.
always love referencing that thing, and it's like it's crazy how much like 3D assets fall into for right dead smack middle into the uncanny valley, and it's like it blows
Mm-hmm.
people's minds. Like, oh well, this is like an actual thing. This is proportionally scientifically correct, and it's like it doesn't. That's not how our brains perceive things, man. Especially like when it's not a human, when it's on a page. Like our brain does not
Mm-hmm.
perceive realism that way.
Hmm. Well, and, like to the 3D assets, especially like using them for backgrounds and stuff, there is an art in like kind of fudging the details in your backgrounds. Like Todd McFarlane, as a modern example, I think was really good with like his
Hmm.
cityscapes, where they're like close enough to real life, but they still have that cartoony element of
Hmm.
exaggeration, of caricature, of reducing down to the bare essential elements.
Well, and your
And I
boy,
think like,
Akira, how the opposite
mm-hmm,
spectrum, and Michael Turner was
mm-hmm,
like that too. Like how detailed it could be and still look awesome.
mm-hmm. And it's all about like finding where you want to lie on the spectrum. But I think if you're just going for realism, then you really lose a lot, especially in the
Hmm.
comic medium. Like going back to Charles Schulz, he's able to reduce it down to the most human elements of what he's trying to talk about and convey. And that's like what I think is important to comics. And I think that's something, talking about keeping it to the Godfo family, I think Josh does really well. And especially as a digital artist, he's able to, have a very stylized approach to his art, a very kind of in ways cartoonish with how he draws his characters, but still he's able to convey all the emotions he needs to, and also give you context of like setting, time, where these things are taking place, enough to um, get you there, get you in the headspace of the characters, so you can enjoy the story. Because the thing too is like with an Alex Ross, he's an amazing, talented artist. But sometimes when I'm reading stuff where he does the art, like I almost get lost in the art and I'm not focusing on the
Mm-hmm.
story anymore. I'm not being just carried through the story. And again, that's the art of reduction and finding the elements that are 100% essential to
Well, yeah,
telling
and
the
I agree.
story.
And I think Alex Ross is a great example because what did he do? He did was it the Supremes and Kingdom Come? Yeah, I may have said that right. I think it was,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's the Supremes, like the Diana Ross group or whatever, but you know what I mean. But
Yeah.
when he does
Yeah.
it, that's the whole point. Is like the story is almost centered around what he's doing, and like that's the whole thing is you make room
Mm-hmm.
for that art and you treat it as this big grandiose thing of what it is. It doesn't. It is not him taking a story and like articulating the art in such a way that it moves the story along. It's like no, the story stops and describes what he's doing.
Oh yeah. Well, and like Alex Ross, as opposed to most comics made in a writer-artist pairing, to my knowledge, he, especially in like the '90s when he started getting his big stuff out, like Marvels and Kingdom Come,
Marvels.
he had a
That's
lot
what I
more
was
say in the
thinking. Not
story.
Supreme. Sorry,
Yeah, because I think he did a lot of the covers
that
for
was it. Yeah.
Supreme though. But with Marvels, I believe that was a pitch he made before he
Well,
even
he
had a
did Kingdom
writer
Come too,
attached. So like, yeah, and I think again, I think that was because Mark Waid wrote that
but I
one,
think
right?
he came up with
Um,
the idea of it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think Alex Rossi has a much more hand in his stories, and I think that's so he can show off his art. And I have nothing against writers working with artists. I mean, that's how comics have been done for the large part of the history. But when it is one person working on it, like either of these examples, Ernie Bushmeyer or Alex Raymond, there's a lot more intentionality, I think, in the storytelling, or at least it's easier to have that intentionality when it's that one voice dictating all the aspects of
Hmm.
the comic.
I agree.
There's no, yeah, there's nothing lost in that communication. Because I mean, like Jack Kirby, the king of comics. As much as I like his stuff with Stan Lee, by the time you get to his solo stuff, like his Fourth World stuff, or especially his 2001: A Space Odyssey series, I think that's some of his best work, both in terms of story structure, pacing, and themes, because it's all him, and it really reads
Hmm.
as all him.
Yeah, and some dudes can hit that, and some
And
dudes can't land that. And again,
oh yeah.
I beat them down so much sometimes I feel bad, but I mean that's what Image was. It was guys taking it
Mm-hmm.
upon themselves who clearly could not, and you kind of realize that's maybe why they were so good at art is that they were this strange breed of dudes that were this artists that were just hyper artists, and they could take a
Mm-hmm.
story and they could turn any story anyone gave they could take any story anyone gave them and make it good, make it look good, and that is crazy. That is a
Mm-hmm.
wild skill, even as they proved that the upper echelon of their field could not do like they could do, and they just couldn't write.
Oh yeah, well, because I mean, like Todd McFarlane, like I think especially in the early issues, the best issue of Spawn in that first like 100 issues are like when you have the
Yep.
guest writers on, and like that Alan Moore issue where it's is it what Billy Kincaid
Yeah.
is in hell, and that story is amazing, and it's like a bottle episode story, but it works so well, and it's so imaginative, and it's so fun to see Todd McFarlane executing Alan Moore's vision. Because I mean, if you know anything about Alan Moore, his script's super detailed, super in depth about how he wants every exact thing to be, and to see Todd McFarlane execute that, I think that shows his strengths both as like an artist and as someone who can convey a writer's ideas
Yeah.
on the page.
I agree.
Oh, and then real quick before we move off of this slide, I do have a collection of some Flash Gordon strips that can elucidate. And this will also be a good way to show the art, but also how these stories would be read, where it would be these. I think most of them are like 5 to 6
Hmm.
panels, as you can see in these 2 pages, and that's all you'd get for a week would be these 5 or 6 panels. But I mean, especially in this page, the amount of detail and hatching and paying attention to like light
Mm-hmm.
sources and shadows is just insane. Like there was really no one doing stuff like Alex Raymond at this time. He was in a league of his own.
It's just ridiculous.
But oh yeah, no, Alex Raymond, like a hugely influential and also just super talented. Also, just a really interesting life. A lot of the comic strip cartoonists at the time had really interesting lives. A lot of them lived in this small town in Connecticut. They were all super rich off of their work. But yeah, Alex Raymond, if you are not familiar with his work, definitely check it out. Especially if you're a comic book artist, aspiring comic book artist, or just a fan. I mean, his artwork still holds up super well, and you can see his influence in people like Bernie Wrightson and Barry Windsor Smith. Like, I don't think you'd get artists like that without an Alex
Mm-hmm.
Raymond.
Yeah,
You want to
yeah, I'm
you want to
trying.
pull up one again
It's
for me?
loading. There it goes.
You're good.
No, you're staying.
We're boom. We're boomering the whole thing. This is not a professional
Without
operation,
trash heap,
guys.
without trash heap
And
here, what
then
are we supposed to do?
exactly. I know. We're not talking about nihilism anymore. We're just talking about comics history. What is this? Um, Here on the left, we have Funnies on Parade, which was the first actual comic book, as opposed to all the stuff we had spoken of previously, um, which were all comic strips. But even then, Funnies on Parade was mostly just reprintings of syndicated strips in the comic book format. It was created by Max Gaines, and I believe the story goes, the legend is that he was, working as a printer for the papers, and he had the tabloid section of the comics, and he folded it down to book size, and was like, "Huh, there's something there." And interesting too with comics history is if you look at the distinction between comic strips and comic books, a lot of the people who were doing big things in comic strips were all WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, whereas a lot of the people who created some of the biggest characters with some of the biggest artists and writers in comic books were all Jewish. And I mean, you have Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Will Eisner, all Jewish, and a lot of that comes from a lot of the people who were doing the printing and ran the printing industry in New York for these newspapers were Jewish, and they were the ones who founded comic books. And when they were looking for fellow artists and people to produce the work for them, they went to the Jewish kids in
Mm-hmm.
the neighborhood because those were the people they already knew. So and then on top of that, there was a lot of discrimination against Jews in the comic strip industry. It was incredibly hard to break into comic strips as a Jew, and that goes to what we have on the right with Golden Age Superman Action Comics #1, which is kind of the true birth in many ways of the modern comic book, both by introducing superheroes and really cementing the format down. But when what was it? Fucking how am I messing up the names? Jerry
Yep.
Siegel and Joe
Joe
Shuster.
Schuster, yeah.
They pit
Yeah.
Joe Shuster. Yeah, they pitched Superman to all the big syndicates and got turned down by all of them because they wanted to have a newspaper strip because that's where the money was at. And they
Mm-hmm.
eventually went to what would become DC Comics and pitched it. So there's a different universe where maybe they weren't discriminated and it became a huge comic strip and it isn't what it is today. And comic books wouldn't be what
Yep.
they are today. And also, I would like to point out to anyone who thought the Superman movie was too political, in the first two appearances of Superman, he goes to a weapons manufacturer, picks him up, flies him to the war zone where his weapons are being used, and makes him participate in the war to see what his weapons are doing. So if anyone thought James Gunn's Superman was too political, I think you should go back to the source
I've got
material because it's kind
I've
of
got my
always
own
been
beef
there.
with James Gunn's Superman, but the political part did not bother me.
Yeah. No, if you have beef with it, that's fine. But anyone, all the Fox News people who are like, Superman's woke. Well, I guess Superman's always been woke. But even then, one thing I do think is interesting art wise is you do see, even in like the early comic books here with Golden Age comics, it is very reminiscent of the comic strips we were seeing, and like it's much closer to them than to what we think of as modern comics. I would kind of describe the style of the art in Superman as almost a cross between like Alex Raymond, super realistic detail and like a Dick
Yep.
Tracy style, kind of somewhat exaggerated. And next, I think we have, let's see. So this is kind of the legacy, and particularly the legacy of that style of cartooning, because you don't really see it anymore in mainstream comics. DC and Marvel, I don't think, really participate in that kind of comic book making anymore. But it had a real resurgence, especially with the underground comics in the 60s. And here we have God Knows, which I had actually never heard of before visiting the Billy Ireland. I'm a huge fan of underground comics, but it is credited as the first
It looks
underground
like it.
comic independently made.
Looks cool.
Yeah, 1964 predates Zap #1, and then Zap is Robert Crumb's
Oh yeah.
comic book, and then on the far right we have Bobby London with Dirty Duck, which is a reference to Crazy Cat, but particularly focusing on Robert Crumb. He of a lot of that crop of artists was one that really focused on technique, on that super detailed
Mm-hmm.
hatching. Like especially his later work is comparable, like that Thomas Nast level of detail.
Yeah, people
But
should
a
know who
lot of
Robert
them
Crumb
really.
is.
Oh yeah, if you don't, what are you doing?
Working.
I actually have, yeah, being a real productive member of society. I have with me. This is an eighth
Yeah.
printing, but Zap Comics no, issue 0, which was supposed to be the first issue, but it got stolen. The original art to show some of what he was doing, and also on top of how well his art was done, just incredibly subversive stuff in his artwork. Like even on the back, there's a mom ripping up comic books because at the time there was all the bans on comic books, the Comics Code of Authority. But even just seeing like a cover like that
Yeah.
at the time, like you wouldn't see anything like this. It was heavily associated with the counterculture, the hippies. I mean, it was the '60s, so everyone was doing acid. But like the first, not counting like this front page, but the first couple pages of it are this meatball strip where meatballs are just falling out of the sky, and it's this very surrealist, absurdist kind of humor. And also just take a look at that
Yeah.
art, like the it's obviously very exaggerated and cartoony, but there's so much detail there, there's so much movement and energy in every single line. Like I personally, I can just look at a panel of his for minutes on end and never get bored, just taking it all in. Um, and like I was saying, like it's he introduced this kind of very surrealist, absurdist kind of humor that was obviously very influenced by the drug and hippie culture of the time, but was something very new to comics, very grimy and underground. And these comics were like heavily censored. Where you get bongs and like rolling papers and stuff. You wouldn't get them at the
Mm-hmm.
comic book store. But they really carried on that legacy. I have another original underground comic. This one was from the Air Pirates, and you can see even in just this cover, it carrying on that legacy of like that very Thomas Nast kind of style, political cartoons, all the stuff we were showing from like the
Mm-hmm.
1800s, and
Is that
it
Mao?
had.
Is that Chairman
um,
Mao?
I don't. I don't. Yeah, it might be. Yeah, you have Chairman Mao, Uncle Sam, and I think he's holding Nixon. And it says a fair trade.
What a funny sentence. I think
well,
he's holding Nixon.
Well, I think this is. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I think it's in reference to because Nixon wasn't he the first president to go over to like Red China at the time,
I think so, yeah.
so it might be that.
Red
But
China.
that's what it was called.
I know, it's just funny.
And then let me find. Got to be careful with this because it's pretty old and beat up, but it's done in like the tabloid style, so it unfolds to read the comics. But
Mm-hmm.
this is like where you'd find a lot of this stuff, these weird publications. But it has this Dirty Duck strip by Bobby London, heavily influenced by George Harriman and Crazy Cat. I mean, the panel layout is very much something that Harriman would have done, and the style is very reminiscent of that. Um, but like they were really carrying on that style that you didn't really see even in comics at the time, because especially in even in comic strips where you still had that more cartoony, caricatured style of cartooning, it had gone from more detailed, hatching heavy, technique heavy to the more Charles Schulz approach of minimal line work. That was kind of the style in vogue. So you had a lot of things those artists were trying to harken back to or rebel against with what was going on in comics. But an incredibly interesting period, and I think a lot of that art, like, I think it's very important to look at now, especially with just mainstream comics. A lot of the art, I mean, some artists working in mainstream comics today are magnificent, but a lot of it personally just doesn't interest me in the way that a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the stuff we're looking at now does, just on a visual level.
Oh, I 100% agree. I'd much rather have something be a little punk or a little different or a little exaggerated or a little off, and instead of the industry standard, especially with the color, like coloring now. I think modern coloring, digital coloring, is just so awful.
Oh yeah, it loses all the texture in life.
Yeah. You got any more stuff you want to show? I can put you back up there.
Yeah, I did have a few more things. I have one
Gotcha.
last slide after, but kind of in the vein of artists who carry on their legacy of those the older stuff we've been looking at. Some other examples. Raw is a huge influence.
Mm,
This is Read Yourself Raw. It's the first like 3 issues I believe compiled, but the art in it, it's everything from like this is I think that who Sampaio, and I can't remember. I can never remember who the writer is. Munoz and Sampaio, but you can see just how different this was because this was coming out in the 80s, early 80s,
yeah, that's
and just how
fantastic.
different. And you can, this was a huge
That looks
influence.
that looks like it's an influence on Miller.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Huge influence
Oh,
on
nice.
Sin City, especially with those
Yeah.
like thick blacks.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Miller, just a side note, they had some of
You're like,
his.
speaking of thick blacks,
Yeah, going a whole different. This is a different stream now.
it's a lot like your little Kim collection.
But when I was at Billy Ireland, they had some of his original Daredevil art,
Mm-hmm.
and the the way the blacks on the page were like they were just solid. And I
Yeah.
like you look at most of other original art. I mean, you know how it is, even if you're not an artist, how to work with like a marker or even like a brush. You get the brush strokes in there. It's never like a perfect flat black. I don't know how Frank Miller achieved it, but looking at those Daredevil pages, and or I think he wouldn't have probably been inking. It was probably Jansen inking. I don't know if he inked for himself, but either way, regardless, it was impressive to see just that solid flat black on the page like that.
Mm-hmm.
But Raw is definitely like this one is done by a guy named Capel, but you can see it's still carrying on that very much cartoony style.
Yeah, but those perspectives and that movement is fantastic.
Oh yeah, well, because like the artists that were in Raw, it was real craft heavy focus. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it was people who took it seriously, but the only place they could get published is Raw because they weren't doing anything. So I guess you had stuff like heavy metal, which give me 1 second, I'll grab some examples of that. One moment, everyone. And I'm back. This is another prized possession of mine that I got from John Workman as well. First issue of Heavy Metal, and
Nice.
so you brought up Mobius earlier. This has got some of his early Arzak work, and again, like it
Beautiful.
was. Oh yeah, like, and this was much more in the like Raw was more experimental, avant-garde comedy kind of stuff. Not all of it comedy, but like kind of more in that classic vein that we were looking at. Whereas this is sci-fi fantasy, still very experimental stuff, but it's where a lot of the artists who couldn't work in DC or Marvel because their style didn't fit the house style, but were still incredibly talented artists
Yeah,
in doing stuff.
fantastic.
Like, especially you want to talk about coloring, like you were earlier, early Richard
Mm-hmm.
Corbin, where he would do airbrush coloring. Like, I don't even know how you achieve that look, but
Yeah,
you
and
definitely can't get
this
that digitally.
no, and just the stark simplicity of it. It's just beautiful, and like the neon kind of look of it. It's crazy
Hmm.
good.
But again, I think it's so interesting, especially in the time period, because in the post underground, um, like there wasn't a place for a lot of these artists to go, so it was like you either had to get your work published in heavy metal, raw, or I also have here with me, let me find it, um, Weirdo magazine, which was what Robert Crumb did in the 80s to 90s, which was kind of on the flip side of where Raw was trying to do this elevated avant-garde kind of style comics in that large format. Robert Crumb was trying to take it back to that, like you were saying, that very punk root. This is one of my
Hmm.
favorite comic book covers of all time. I love it so much. It just speaks to me. But like I'm trying to find some of the stuff, but like that really raw, very
Yep.
grungy, super exaggerated. And obviously that style like wouldn't really work for a Marvel if you're doing like a Spider-Man comic. But I do think that like there should be a place in mainstream comics for styles like this to still live on. And I think it would make mainstream comics way more interesting, even if there was like an anthology that DC or Marvel put out where artists could just do weird stuff like this.
Well, and to their credit, I mean, Image and Dark Horse have tried that to like
Mm-hmm.
give that kind of space to them. As much as I, rip on the original startup of Image creators, I
Yeah.
rip on them so much. Um, they have given like the Image now, or I shouldn't say now, but like the past 25 years has given great opportunity to people. I mean, it's like where something like the Max,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. I don't know if they published the Max, but
Oh yeah, they did. Yeah, that was one
something
of
like,
their
yeah.
early titles.
You couldn't have gotten that Sam Keith kind of stuff anywhere else,
Or what
even though
was
he
that
was
one?
with Marvel before, like,
Yeah, well, most of them were. Yeah. Well, what's interesting though is like when they had the freedom to just do what they wanted, they're doing much more in that weirder vein.
yeah.
I'm blanking on the name of the artist who did Trencher, but like Trencher was an early Image series as well. Super weird, but like it harkens back to like when comics were super expressive in that way.
Keith Giffen.
Keith Giffen, yeah, yeah. And then another one.
Oh, this looks great. This looks fantastic.
Are you looking up Trencher?
Yeah, it almost looks like what's his name? Doug Tanaple,
I haven't
who
heard of him.
did
I'll have to check
Earthworm
him out.
Jim. He did Earthworm Jim.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah, I know that.
Yeah, he's also put out a lot of different comics. But yeah, that's that kind of wacky but super kind of like clearly this person knows what they're doing style.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Oh yeah, and with Trencher, I do not envy the colorist who had to do that because
Yeah,
like
the
the
different colors
lines,
and the different
yeah,
shades. Yeah,
yeah, because his line work, like I don't know how you look at a page of without color and know what's going on in some of those panels.
I mean, this looks very 90s in a good way. Like this is
Mm-hmm.
like where you get those cartoons like Eek the Cat, Ren and
Mm-hmm.
Stimpy, and that kind of stuff from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
like you
really
were,
cool. I've never heard of this before, man.
oh yeah, no, it's a really fun series. And like you were saying, like Image gave a place to at least some of that stuff that kind of bordered on the mainstream, but did those weirder things. But I feel like there's not really. I mean, Image still puts out some books that are kind of experimental, but like the only place I find a lot of modern stuff is the publisher of this, Fantagraphics. Like they're the only ones in comics that have like really any influence. I feel like because there's other really good indie publishers like Top Shelf puts out some good stuff. I'm blanking on other names, but there are places to find good indie comics that do weird stuff like this, but they never have any impact on anything outside of the indie comics realm, which is disappointing because, like, something like Daniel Klaus, where he's had influence outside of just the indie comic sphere, a lot of that came from, like, film adaptations of his work. But, if you want a really good introduction to, if you've only really read mainstream comics, you want an introduction to kind of the indie side, the alternative side. Daniel Klaus is a great place to start. Um, and his art is very much in that cartoony vein. Here's some examples of it, but he's also very wide ranging in his styles and approach. I mean, yeah, Velvet Glove Cast and Iron, which was serialized in the first couple issues of Eight Ball. Um, the style in it is very good. It's like a weird Lynchian kind of noir, surreal story. Like
Hmm.
he's one of those artists, very big on craft and technique, very much in that kind of Robert Crumb vein. And a lot of those artists that I just brought up were from like the 60s to 90s. And then I have some more modern examples of people that I think really carry on that legacy that I wanted to bring up. One of them is Charles Forsman, who's seen some success. As you can see, this was adapted into a Netflix show. His other book, End of the Fucking World, was also adapted. But this, it's very much in like that EC Segar style. I actually got to talk to him, and I
Uh,
brought that up, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that's basically olive oil from
I
Popeye."
was about to say that like that kid in the top right looks like olive oil.
Yeah, exactly. And what's cool is like he'll kind of mix up his style for each of his projects, but there is something about like the stories he'll tell with that kind of art that's very expressive. Um, Another guy I met, Matty Keene. This is his bootleg Spider-Man.
Yeah.
This is basically what inspired me to do my own bootleg on my Instagram. A little plug if you want to check that out.
Yep. Now I
Bootleg
got it in
Batman
the
comic.
chat right here.
Hell yeah. Um, but his still very in that much in that vein, down to like the
Hmm.
paper texture he's got on there is very much that punk kind of feel. He keeps that lo-fi kind of quality to it. Great cartoon. He's a super nice
Yeah,
guy too.
that's really cool art.
Oh yeah, one of the
Like
best part.
that middle panel of the woman's face looks great.
Oh yeah,
Yep.
that's Mary Jane before you find out she's morbidly obese.
That's funny.
But Matty Keene is, there's some color pages in the back. But Matty Keene is one of the people working in comics right now that is just super exciting to me. That's doing all the stuff I want to see in comics. Incredibly talented, and if there's anyone carrying on that vein now that I think you should check out, it's him. I mean, he's putting out new books all the time. Super talented guy. He's got this one that's coming out. I think it's shipping out now. I had it pre-ordered, so I'm waiting for it to show up on my doorstep. Like it's called like L'Uomo Lucci. It's like a reference to old Italian like crime, horror, thriller kind of books and stuff. And he's so into the craft where he's like making the book look like it would be an old Italian book you'd find at a used bookstore. Um,
Hmm.
so that is endlessly talented guy, and I'm always excited for new stuff he's doing. And then another guy, modern, working in comics, and I'm gonna butcher his name. It's like Tony Ayupi or something like that. But I met him at Heroes Con as well. That's where I got this, and this man can fucking draw in so many different styles. Like here's him mimicking the Crazy Cat style
Oh,
in
nice.
this really cool meta story. And let me show you some other examples, but then he'll have these really cool black and white ones with like gray tones mixed in there, mixing up his style constantly, like story to story, where like these two have very different styles and it's the same dude. I mean, just look at the cover. It's a dinosaur battling some cowboys, and then the back cover is whatever this horrific image is. So definitely check him out if you're interested by any of the stuff we're talking about. And then if you'll pull up the PowerPoint, I have one last slide, which is a bit of a shameless plug, but kind of the influence a lot of this stuff has had on my own work. So I
Nice.
have some pictures. This is a strip I just put out on my Instagram called Mondo, Mike, and L. I made it while cause I was at my mom's. She lives up in Columbus. I made it pretty much as soon as we got home. Started working on it when we got home from the Billy Ireland. Just inspired by everything I saw, and really wanted to try and do that craft style of like really technical, having a lot of that hatching, a lot of that detail. Obviously, with my own kind of twist with these weird alien looking dudes. And I have some other examples with me here.
Is the last panel a reference to the like the meme?
Yeah, the
Yeah,
thousand yard stare. Um,
I love that one. Don't worry about it. And suddenly there's like a demon face, and that's funny. It's
that
almost
one's
it reminds me of like Abbott and Costello. Like,
yeah. Well, like I'm a big fan of all that kind of like vaudeville
yeah,
inspired slapstick stuff, which is very much in the vein of a lot of that older comic stuff. Um, but
we
here,
need to talk about German expressionism
oh yeah,
like
for
one day
sure. That
because
would be a great topic
that's
for a
my
skit.
favorite film work
Oh
is
yeah,
German expressionism.
that was a huge influence on the stuff I was going for in the bootleg Batman. And then here, this is a pamphlet that I've done more printings. It was originally for the my AI protest, but it's a reference to that Zap issue 0.
Yeah.
Um, so I try to take a lot of that into account in my own work, and then these you can get on my Shopify,
Hmm.
my Who Are You mini comic. But this is very influenced by all that old cartooning work, especially like Max Fleischer kind of cartoons from the 1930s with those very fluid animated bodies and stuff. And then in the back, there's some bonus art of sketches I did, and really trying to hone that craft and technique element in my work um, from those guys. And I would really like to keep the influence of those older cartoonists alive and work today, because you just don't see it much, and I don't want to say disappointing, because it's obviously not for everyone, but like I do think there is something to it, and I do think like there should be a space for that in modern comics where that can thrive, and you can make money off of it, because that's the big thing too, is how do you make money off this stuff. And I just, not just for my sake, but all those people I mentioned, I would love for them to all have huge fruitful careers, but most people going to the comic book store are not looking for that kind of stuff. But I think that is the most interesting things in comics are happening in this indie underground space that's taking a lot from the old but doing new things with it, because I don't think it should just be a pastiche of all these old styles, or just be nostalgia bait for things like that. I think it's about blending those old techniques and styles and aesthetics with new technology, newer techniques, newer aesthetics, finding that middle ground between them. And that's what I try to do with a lot of my work, is try and find that middle ground between the old and the new, and try and push my art forward, push comics forward in that way that I don't see, unfortunately, a lot of that happening in the mainstream.
Yeah, I don't either. I feel like it's become very stagnant. Do you have another slide after this?
No, that's the last one. I think the last one I had on there was just a white slide, unfortunately. But I did want to kind of leave this last part of the stream, kind of just have a discussion about kind of that idea of like where to take comics from here to keep those things alive. Because I mean, I even see some of that in Josh's work. I don't know if he takes particular influence from a lot of the things we discussed, but I do see him having some things that harken back to the older techniques, especially in like the Apollyon books, having that black and white aesthetic, harkening back to like the '80s black and white explosion.
Yeah, I mean that's where he gets a lot of his inspiration from. Is I mean he's older than you or I, and so he lived through a lot of that stuff. He he remembers when Image happened, and he remembers what was before that, like the Dark Knight Returns and that kind of stuff. And I think about this idea a lot. I mean, I'd really like to have a whole other conversation about it because I think to me I think ignorance is the main problem with the comic community, mainstream and indie. I think comics are at a point where they are
Mm-hmm.
everything's an homage, everything's a callback to something from 5 years ago tops.
Yeah.
Indies go has indies the bigger indies go back a little bit further, like to the 90s basically. That's why everything looks like Image. Particularly everything tries to look like Silvestri or McFarlane and fails. And I think it's too narrow. I think and what's weird is like you talk to a lot of these guys in indie and mainstream, and they clearly enjoy other art. They
Mm-hmm.
enjoy things from different perspectives, but it's like they don't know how or just will outright not include it in their art.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Well,
it's too
like,
much of a risk.
and I get that, because again, like what sells isn't that.
Yeah.
Like I mean, if we look at what sold best in 2024, it was Absolute Batman. That was like the best
But
selling
again,
comic.
like, is it that it's not selling because it's not known or not made? Because like the things that inspire them are being to do the weird stuff are selling because they
Mm-hmm.
like it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's selling in different mediums. You're right. It's just not selling in comic medium.
Well, because like if you look at a lot of the big cartoons, like animated cartoons of the last 10 years, I mean, a lot of them have more harkening back to the styles we talked about. I've been recently rewatching Gravity Falls, and that cartoony style is very much still in the vein of stuff you would have seen in the 30s and 40s. Obviously modernized, but it still has that in its veins. Like animation has been able to maintain that 2D animation, even in the digital space, has been able to maintain that kind of aesthetic or technique element to it. But in comics, it's been completely lost. And I feel like a lot of people, again, not to just shit on people who do realistic art because there is merit to that, but I do think that too many people, if they see a book that's doing something that isn't in that realistic house style Marvel DC, they'll just they don't take it seriously or they think it's amateurish, which I don't think is giving enough credit to a lot of those artists.
I think so too. I think that's why people really, really, really jump on anything that kind of breaks the mold. I mean, it was a couple of years ago, it was Sean Gordon Murphy, who absolutely, as far as art style goes, deserves that. Then Daniel Warren Johnson. Um, it's whenever someone comes, and I'm not ripping those guys. They're very talented, especially at what they do. But it's like I think there's more of those guys than we realize. They're just
Mm-hmm.
not given the space. And I know for a fact Sean Gordon Murphy has gone on interviews and has relentlessly preached that. And because he's just that dude's a bulldog, and he has said that he's like, no, like I stand up for myself 100%. He very much reminds me of McFarlane in that way. McFarlane was a bulldog,
Mm-hmm.
and I think most artists aren't. I think most artists are just happy to be getting a paycheck and not having to work a 9 to 5 in that way, even if it's not a really good paycheck,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But I think they're more than willing to put their head down and accept the work and just do it that way.
Well, like that's going back to Image. That's what we saw with Image is when these artists were unrestrained and allowed to do their own thing. Because I think like Sam Keith wasn't he doing like Hulk before he went on to do the Max?
I
I think.
I think he was. I know he did Wolverine. He did that
Yeah,
one
he did
Wolverine one where
Wolverine.
he introduced Cyber, and that's my favorite Wolverine story.
Yeah, and you see, like, I mean, obviously his Marvel work still really good, but when he's unrestrained and he's doing something like the Max, where he's just allowed
Hmm.
to go in any direction he wants, you can see like the gears turning, and like he's like, oh, I have freedom now. And
Hmm.
on top of that, not only was he able to do that, but it sold, and it sold really well. And we haven't seen that since Image. But like, there's clearly a space if these artists can make a name for themselves in a mainstream space, and then find a way to shift that towards another direction, the audience might follow them. But like we saw that with Image, there is clearly an audience who will appreciate some weirder stuff in their comics.
Yeah, I think people go there for that. I think that's with everything. I mean, I'm a musician, and I remember Napster, and um, Napster did help kill music money making. There's just no getting around that. But it also file sharing on the digital age also showed that the average person would listen to a wider range of music than anyone else thought.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always been my problem with the term normie with the internet. Is like, man, the person you call a normie will listen and ingest most anything on a spectrum. They're just not as crazy autistic as you online,
Yeah.
or not as political as you online. But like the average person will has for all of human history. I mean, we used to worship the sun god and like believe that like the Birdman came down and mated with the goat and made they don't believe
Yeah.
anything in a good way. In a good way, the stories have always
Yeah.
been wide spectrum. Sorry.
Oh no. Well, and like to your point about the at least for music with Napster, the Overton window essentially shifting and more weird kind of music being able to float to the mainstream. We do see that with internet culture, but interestingly enough, like you don't see it penetrating comics in that way.
Hmm.
As a business,
Well,
which
there's
like
only
if it
two.
weren't, yeah, exactly. And I don't know if it's the business model that would need to change or if it's really just like fans don't want that. But I do think, especially like online in the circles I'm in on like Instagram with a lot of these alternative underground cartoonists, there is an audience that likes this stuff. I mean, people like that drawing style. They like that kind of approach to the art. It's just how do you get it past just being like an Instagram thing or just something you pick up at a
hmm
con and being a sustainable business model to it too.
Well, my thing is the manga comics debate. It's the wrong debate. People make it a dialectic, and it's not. What manga proved was that the average person will read weird comics.
Hmm.
If we called manga comics, there wouldn't be a dialectic,
Oh yeah,
if that makes
absolutely.
sense.
Because oh yeah, well, it's the same storytelling mechanics as
hmm
comics. You know, sequential panels telling a story. But yeah, people for some reason when it's labeled manga, are much more open to more experimental approaches to storytelling or just weirder subject matter. Um, and a broader array of subject matter and genres. Whereas comics, even though they have evolved so much since their inception, it seems now it's just still relegated to superheroes, and then maybe you'll have
hmm
like like an image book that's like a crime thriller or a sci-fi thing break through. But aside from like the one or two major examples like Saga or The Walking Dead, you don't really get that outside of like you're just getting superhero stuff.
Yeah, and Scott Pilgrim even kind of got very, very lucky with the movie. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not downplaying that series. It was a good comic series. I thought it was a little too long and a little too on the nose, but um, that literally happened because a guy who made movies liked that series.
Mm-hmm.
That was almost a fluke in that sense.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not downing that series. I'm just saying that is not a replicatable resource. But
Well, like
um,
something like Bone, the success
yeah,
something
I
like
love
Bone
Bone.
had. Oh yeah, Bone's
But Bone had
amazing.
slow success too, though.
Well, and also I think part of its success was since it was like marketed towards kids, it was able to operate outside of like the mainstream, you know,
hmm
superhero kind of idea of what a comic book was, and able to find success that way. But if Bone proves anything, it's like, oh no, people will read something where the character
hmm
designs are odd and cartoonish, but the story goes in weird directions and it's this weird fantasy story, but people will still read it and really connect to it, and it'll find its audience and be financially successful.
Well, Bone changed a lot for me with comics, and a couple of things is Bone kind of flopped initially because it people thought it was a kid's book, and he got two really big hits in his life in his career. Which I mean, he was consistent. He's a fantastic artist. First of all, you can't ever take that away from Jeff Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic artist, fantastic writer, um, or fantastic writer or fantastic artist all around. He did his own covers and art and all that for crying out loud. Well, but I think Neil Gaiman gave him a shout out early in his career. He had found it at like an airport, and during an interview, he was like, "I found this wonderful comic called Bone, and I bought like the first 6 issues. I loved it." And that was a pretty prominent interview, so that gave him a massive boost. And then I think he was the first, or maybe second, may have been the first comic picked up by Scholastic.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was his series was already somewhat successful and it's still going, but that really is what made Bone like a household name was Scholastic.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying is Disney Adventures picked up Bone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it
And I
was
think it
the
was
little little kids
well,
magazine.
yeah, yeah, and I think for a brief moment too, in like the late '90s, I think it was published by Image for a
Yep.
little bit. Yeah.
It's
Um.
so I'm not downplaying. What I'm saying is exactly what you're saying is that these things exist, but until people see it and know about it, they don't know. Like
Mhm.
I think people will 100%. I don't think the average person is as stupid as people make them out to be. I don't think it's this. I don't think people are this white Protestant 80s movie villain that normies are portrayed as. I don't think
Yeah.
that archetype exists anymore. I think people are much more open to art than we believe or been
Oh
led to
yeah.
believe.
And I think it's just about like having venues for those things to be found. Like the Neil Gaiman shout out reminds me of when Wizard magazine was, you know, the biggest thing in comics, and that's where people got their
hmm
comic book news. There was Palmer's Picks, which would
Yep.
shout out the weirder stuff like Ed the Happy Clown and Daniel Klaus, and you know those more obscure books, and then they'd be able to find prominence. But since we don't have anything like Wizard in comics anymore, or really in culture in general. There's not like one guiding, gatekeeping kind of voice, which is good and bad. But since we don't have that, it's harder for those smaller things to find that audience. Because you could be a kid who's picking up Wizard just because there's like an interview with Todd McFarlane or Rob Liefeld, and then you find out about, oh shit, there's this thing called Sandman by Neil Gaiman that Palmer's Picks is talking about, or Ed the Happy Clown, or like a
Hmm.
Velvet Glove Cast in Iron, and then you can go down that. But like, there's no way to bridge that gap as easily without those kind of gatekeepers in the comics culture.
Oh yeah, that's what influencers are for, unfortunately. Um, and that's what manga had that comics didn't at that point. Was, I mean, I was alive when that happened. Is like manga was shared online freely. You could just get it and download. You could download an artist's 20 years work in like 10 minutes,
Mm,
and it created this appetite that when it finally published over here, that's what's amazing to people. Manga as it is now is a still relatively new thing in America
mm.
in the physical form. But when it hit, it had a built-in audience.
Oh yeah, and it's again like just I think finding those avenues for these things to get exposure in that way that we're
Hmm.
talking about is the main thing. But as of right now, we just don't have those avenues. And if there's a way to build those in a way that can reach more people, until we have those, I don't know if we'll have the kind of comics getting the attention that I want. But I mean, I can dream.
I think we're still in the this is my music set is like the Ramones versus the grunge era whenever grunge hit with Nirvana and Soundgarden, like only like three of those bands really knew each other. Now it's Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and Pearl Jam. They didn't know Nirvana. Nirvana was from Seattle, not Portland, and they were having talks with Johnny Ramone and the Ramones were like, hey man, like up in New York, like it was every band for itself, like, and that's the kind of famine mindset that the Ramones had. And in the grunge era, it was like everybody knows everybody and we're here together. And it
Mm,
made a whole movement. I think we're still in the Ramones era of
mm,
comics.
absolutely.
Despite all of the indie comic stuff, Comicsgate didn't turn out the way people thought it did. Anti-Comicsgate didn't turn out the way people thought it would. No one really cares about those movements in the mainstream. They're not
Mm,
relevant, and the mainstream really isn't relevant. There's not a big collective
yeah.
thing. I think we're still in the era, unfortunately, of every creator for himself.
Yeah, and I do agree, and maybe this is wishful thinking, but I do think, especially my experience at Heroes Con this year, I do think the tides were maybe shifting a little bit. There was a real sense of community with these smaller creators and a lot of energy, a lot of momentum, and
Hmm.
I feel like it's really just that kind of like the glass ceiling metaphor, just like
Yeah,
waiting for that to break, and then these things.
yeah,
I
and
think there's an
that's what I'm
audience for
hoping
it.
for. Yeah, I'm hoping for that more collaborative scene type idea of someone punches through that ceiling, and it's because they're standing with like 10 other people,
Yeah.
and they all pour out.
Well, and a big thing too that we don't see anymore in comics that was able to help elevate a lot of these voices was anthologies. Anthologies were
Hmm.
a huge part of comics. So, and usually, because like I'm using Weirdo or Raw as an example, you'd have a big artist at the kind of forefront. Raw, you had Art Spiegelman of Mouse fame, and Weirdo, you had Robert Crumb. And then by them being a bigger name, able to carry all these other artists up with them. But like, I mean, up until like the '90s and stuff, anthologies were still huge, especially with like Fantagraphics. But now, I can't remember the last time I saw an anthology being published with a bunch of artists together outside of just like some zines and stuff.
Yeah, and I think music's the same way, and I think that's part of it too. Is like I think comics has an advantage.
Oh, Dan, did I lose you?
Digital easier. Yeah, I should be
Oh,
back
you're
now. Am I
back.
back now?
Yeah.
Yeah, comics can be read online, of course, but it seems like they still have more of a physical presence than music does. And bands are still doing like share EPs and stuff, like
Mm-hmm.
double-sided EPs where one band gets like two or three songs, vice versa, and all that kind of stuff. So that still exists in the underground. It's just hard for them to exist, it to keep going. But I feel like and we're trying to navigate that field as well in comics, is that people do want something cool to hold on to, but you also, and Josh and I were talking about this today, like, because we're huge fans of Evangelion, right?
Mhm.
Evangelion, for those who have seen it, know that it's like 99% aesthetic. The dialogue almost does not matter that entire show, and that's what's so brilliant about it. But on the other side, from day one of its kind of like acceptance into media, it's had people writing and talking about it. It's always had this deep lore explanation, or exploration, I should say. We are talking about with Godfo, like that's why I'm writing like 100, 200-page codexes that go with Kolga and that stuff, and the Apocrypha, is that I think you have to give people something that their brains can gnaw on. I think people
Mhm.
want that. I think people want more and more and more, and I really think we should respect consumers. But the thing is, people aren't giving it to them. And that's one reason I think people like the daunting task of something like One Piece or Naruto, where it's like, oh, I've got this story for years.
Mhm.
That turns some people off, but apparently it doesn't turn off enough to not make
Yeah.
those billion-dollar industries.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think people want more. I think people want more for their buck. I think they want more for their imagination than people are giving. My goodness, people will sit and listen to 3 or 4 hour podcasts. And if you had that discussion with anyone in the early 2000s, that the internet would be people listening to lectures and people talking for 4 hours, they'd be like, no, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's longer than a movie. Why would I listen to two people talk for longer than a movie?
Yeah. Why would anyone listen to us talk? What do we have to
I don't,
say,
yeah,
right?
I've already muted me.
Cool. I think probably want to wind down, wrap up
Yeah.
soon, but I really like this conversation, especially this kind of latter half. Once we had all the history kind of laid out to kind of talk about these things, because they're definitely on our minds, and I imagine we're not the only ones who are thinking these things, talking about these things, and wanting these things.
I'd hope not. I think comics are in a, to me, they're in a very boring place. I'm not trying to be like judgmental or what. Well, you know what? I will be judgmental. Like to me, it's sad that Absolute Batman is like the number one sold DC thing, because that is not a good series. And I get it. I understand people want something different, but it's like, okay, why can't we have hordes of different things? You know,
Yeah, I get
I
it, man.
think I think we need to expect better of our artists, and artists need to expect better of themselves.
Yeah, it's a two-way street.
Yep. Well, all right, everybody, go check out our stuff. Check out our godfouniverse.com website. Uh, Brody here contributes to it as well. Josh and I do a lot of the work as well. Check out Brody's work at Addison Brodi. You can see a lot of his stuff on Instagram for free. Pick up his copies of his books from his website. There are links in his bios, links in our bios, and we
Give
have
us
stuff
money.
coming out. Yeah, right. And we have stuff launching later this year, that we're collaborating on together, and we'll be back soon. We're trying to get, again, going with this thing of getting people more. We're trying to find a way to get in person and do massive, very long talks and upload those.
Yeah,
So,
so stay tuned.
yep. All right. Peace, fellas.
See you guys.